A few months ago, the entire country writhed in frustration over what was going on in Beirut. It was there that the terrorists held 35 American hostages hijacked on a TWA flight from Rome and Athens. There that one American was ceremoniously executed. There, in the opinion of some critics of administration policy, that the United States went a long way toward losing its manhood. Defenders of administration policy reply by asking simply, what would you have done? With a view to inquiring into the specific question and to exploring the tactical and strategic ramifications of the hostage problem in the age of terrorism, we have convoked three experts.
There was no clear military option to rescue the Israeli prisoners. In difference from instances in which, let's say, hostages are taken inside Israel and at a risk, admittedly, they can be rescued by a military assault.
You know, Colonel Amin type thing.
Yes.
Entebbe type thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in this case, there was no such apparent possibility, at least.
Well, doesn't that simply put a premium on making escape impossible on the part of the terrorists, that is to say?
Well,
you know, if they know that Israel can only be negotiated with if Israel becomes convinced that rescue is out of the question, then the objective becomes to make rescue out of the question.
That's right.
Okay.
Clearly.
Yeah.
I think really that, you know, governments declare principles. A policy is a statement of principles.
Yeah.
And the principle is that they will not make concessions, they will not negotiate with terrorists to make concessions. You start with that principle. You look at the reality of each case, and then you decide if, in fact, you can hold to that principle throughout the case. And there may be other compelling reasons why that principle may not apply.
Well, let me ask Mr. Ackerman something. Under the Geneva Protocols, a prisoner of war is rather strictly defined. His profile has to be almost palpable. But even as no longer is it fashionable to declare war, we simply fight. So these sub-distinctions tend to lose their once distinctive clarity. There is a sense, I think, in which our hostages on that TWA flight were properly viewed as prisoners of war. That is to say, there is an ongoing war conducted by these terrorists in Lebanon, and they took some Americans, and they became hostages in that war. Now, they weren't sacramentalized as prisoners of war, but I'm asking you this question. Do we incorrectly treat them other than as such by giving their liberation a higher than intelligent sense of priority? What I'm asking you is, does it make sense if your strategy is not localized in the sense of saying we want these people back and we'll worry about tomorrow, if we're saying whatever we do today is going to influence what happens tomorrow, and under the circumstances we have really a primary stake in suggesting that terrorism is not a successful way to do business?
Well, our government has embraced a policy of no negotiation. That is our policy.
Well, that's a theoretical embrace, isn't it?
It is absolutely a theoretical
but it's
embrace.
Not an
a posture.
Embrace.
It's a posture, really, and not a policy, because in point of fact, we do negotiate. And we've negotiated on a number of
It's a posture in the sense we become poseurs, but it is not really, it does not govern our actions, does it?
I don't think it should in every case, and let me address this case in particular. And I agree with Mike that in our society we place tremendous emphasis on human life, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But there are other considerations that might even argue for some sort of negotiations in a case that are in addition to the concern about human life. And I think in the TWA episode they were applicable. Number one, if the alternative was to create or to fall into a protracted hostage episode in Beirut, similar to that we experienced in Iran,
yeah.
during which our policy in Lebanon, U.S. policy in Lebanon,
Was dictated.
And indeed, our policy in the Middle East would be paralyzed. Increasingly, the government at home, the administration, would be crippled by having to devote more and more of its attention to a crisis in Beirut in the same way that the Iranian hostage episode, to a large extent, crippled the Carter administration in its last year. And if a further price of that was going to be serious adverse effects on our long-range strategic relationship with the State of Israel, then we have to say that apart from our principle of no negotiations, no concessions, it is not in our strategic interest to fall into that kind of a trap. We should get out of this episode as fast as we can.
Well, now, let me ask you this: do you observe Mr. Jenkins' distinction here? If you had a plan de pouvoir in Israel, would you say, okay, I will discuss with anybody under any circumstances an exchange of prisoners, just as the United States exchanged Gary Powers with that Russian colonel. I can't remember his name, even though I wrote a novel about him. But anyway.
Rudolf Abel.
Yeah, right. That I'll do. But under no circumstances will Israel enter into negotiations with anybody where there is a terrorist leverage operative. Is that the distinction which I understand, Mr. Jenkins, to be that you would observe?
You do have to play it by ear to an extent. You can't really hold to a very, very strict, predefined policy of never negotiate. I don't think it's practical. And they can bring, if necessary, some possible scenarios. I don't think we have to mention them. Everyone can envision, some kind of a cataclysmic terrorist scenario. We don't want to encourage it. But in reality, you have to maintain some kind of flexibility. However, I'd say that still, in general, the declared policy must be no concessions. I don't say no negotiations, no concessions to terrorist demands, and indeed try to minimize concessions to terrorists unless absolutely necessary for some grand strategic reason. And three, which has not been mentioned yet, but Mike mentioned it in his speeches and writing, one has to make sure that this type of incident never pays for the terrorist. That is, if you have to make concessions, punish them later. You must punish them later, and this has not been done in the recent TWA case.
Isn't it, in fact, impossible to codify what it is that a country living in these circumstances may and may not do? That it's got to be a morally spontaneous action by the chief executive sometimes, for which he must not be expected to be accountable by any rigid accounting and common law.
Very good one.
Would you agree?
I agree in a general way, yes. I don't think that any democratic country may allow a situation of complete unaccountability. But I do think that combating terrorism is a form of warfare that is going to stay with us a long time. And there is a terrible kind of imbalance. Terrorists, as you pointed out before, take hostages and regard it as a legitimate means of war. We do not allow them ourselves to go after these terrorists and kill them.
That's right.
As we would do with enemy soldiers.
That's right,
so
that's
it's terrible imbalance.
Yeah.
Not the only way, but one of the most important ways to combat terrorism in this kind of situation is indeed by covert actions. And these cannot be readily put under very strict laws of do's, don'ts, and various kinds of approval.
Oh, they don't work?
Absolutely.
Any problems there?
No, these
I have problems. You know, we were chatting before the show, and we were concerned that we would all agree with each other, and wouldn't that be boring? And I was certain in my own mind that that would never prove to be the case, that we certainly would disagree, and we do disagree, in a certain extent. I don't believe, covert action is one thing. I think we want to be very, very careful, though, that we not slide into the notion that the only effective way to combat terrorism, and indeed that an appropriate way for us to combat terrorism, is to adopt the terrorist methods themselves.
Well, Dr. Marari is not against being careful.
Even beyond being careful on this. I mean, our response to terrorism can't be to go out there and match them car bomb for car bomb, assassination for assassination, embassy for embassy. I say that for moral considerations. I say it because of legal considerations. But let me make the argument for practical considerations.
Yeah, sure.
That is not a kind of war. It's not a style of warfare where we would have the advantage. Our opponents in that kind of warfare are hard to identify, hard to locate. We have many vulnerable targets that they can hit. Number two, given the way we operate, we are likely to wring our hands and try to think carefully about every operation. Our opponents will not hesitate. We will have concerns about killing innocent civilian bystanders.
God knows the French have just discovered that, haven't they?
They will have no such constraints. Yeah. And therefore, it seems to me that if you make the choice to enter the battlefield, you not enter the battlefield in a way that's defined by your opponent, where your opponent has those advantages. Our real concern, I think, is perhaps less so with the apprehension or the elimination of individual terrorists. When we talk about, let's say, dealing with individual members of Islamic Jihad, I don't even know what Islamic Jihad is. Islamic Jihad has as many members as it needs to have, and they'll replace that one with another one. Our real concern is with persuading those people that are behind things like Islamic Jihad that this is a policy
unprofitable.
That it will be unprofitable. There will be a cost attached to this policy.
And how?
That's warfare.
How would you do that?
I don't think, therefore, as I say, I don't think terrorists offer us that many lucrative targets. As I say, they're hard to identify. They don't need a big logistic structure. There's nothing to hit with a conventional sense. We have difficulty doing that. We have legal problems. We have operational difficulties in doing that. We can't get good enough intelligence out of the Middle East. So how are we going to know where and when to get these people to actually carry out these operations? They're a lot more difficult to carry out than it seems watching motion pictures. I would say, in that particular sense, if we believe, and there's strong evidence to support in many of these cases, that either, say, for example, the government of Iran, the government of Syria, or in some cases the government of Libya or some other government, is behind a campaign of terrorism against us, not just one episode, but there are a number of things going on that they are involved in instigating, supporting, assisting, directing. Fine. We make that case. We divulge that case. Let's do it the way we do it best. Let's take it before Congress and seek a congressional resolution. We are being treated as a belligerent. We will return the favor.
Yeah, a Gulf of Tonkin type thing? Or do you mean a declaration of war?
As you pointed out, people don't declare war anymore.
Yeah, but I think that's a pity.
It is tantamount. I mean, a declaration of belligerent status is tantamount.
Yeah, right.
To a
but George
war.
Kennan came out for declaring war against Iran.
And I would have
on the grounds there was never a clearer casus belli than that.
I would have no difficulty with that. I would say that such a declaration, number one, would first of all put Congress appropriately on the spot. Congress deserves to be on the spot. Right now, the executive branch has to deal with terrorism. Congress can offer all sorts of exhortations, but doesn't have to vote on anything.
Right.
Well, here's an opportunity to vote.
Right.
And here's an opportunity for the American public to declare its will.
To recognize really what the de facto and the de jure relationship between you and Iran is in a situation in which Iran has imprisoned 100 of your nationals and done so over a protracted period. That is an act of war.
In that case,
but to do what?
All right.
Well, that's up to the commander-in-chief. That is to say, he can do nothing. He doesn't have to start dropping atom bombs.
right.
But the point is that whatever he does is protected by a judicial code that is appropriate to parties contending in times of war.
Let me define, or let me try to give an instance of what terrorism is not. In 1944, the British Royal Air Force sets out on a bombing mission. The target is the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen. Perfect target. The planes loose the bombs, drop the bombs, and they miss. Instead of the Gestapo headquarters, they hit a children's hospital, and scores of children are horribly killed. This is an accidental, tragic outcome of war. This can happen, but it is not terrorism. Because what terrorists do is target the innocent deliberately, and therefore my definition of terrorism is the systematic and deliberate attack, the murder, maiming, and menacing of innocents, of civilians, for political goals. Let me give you an evil far greater, actually greater than the evil of apartheid. Apartheid is one of the great evils of the world today, but on a comparative basis, it pales even before the evil of Nazi occupation of Europe. I would say that the Nazi occupation of Europe, with the slaughter of millions, was perhaps the greatest evil, not in this century, but in history. Now, it's interesting that, and I take my example from France, none of the resistance movements in Nazi-occupied Europe, and especially the French resistance, none of the resistance movements practiced or even condoned the practice of terrorism. They did not bomb to smithereens German children and the wives of German officers who were readily available as targets. They didn't do this because no cause justifies terrorism. And they were fighting for honorable causes, as honorable fighting men. And I think that we should, I don't think, frankly, that terrorism waged in any kind of conflict is justifiable. It should not be justified. It should not be a resort to violence that we can agree to. But it doesn't mean that terrorists may not occasionally engage in guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is the attack by irregular formations on regular military units. Terrorists may occasionally lapse into regular military combat. But the interesting thing about this group, the Syrians and the terrorists who work for them, is that the overall pattern of what they do is not the bombing of Marine barracks. It's the bombing of embassies. It's the kidnapping of diplomats. It's the killing of innocent professors from Beirut University. It's the sending of hit squads into Europe to massacre and rape civilians in airports. I would add, though, that in discussing the problem of what to do about terrorism, I would take the categorizations that you gave, Claude, and I would structure them a little differently. We've had terrorism throughout history for all sorts of reasons, ethnic reasons, and there are always grievances and class grievances and any kind of conflict that you can think of, religious, plenty of conflicts are available in the world, and many have produced local terrorism. But international terrorism, the terrorism that now sweeps the capitals of Europe and elsewhere, the terrorism that affects and disrupts our airways and our commerce and so on, all of that is the work recently of governments. Without governments, without the embassies that they give terrorists, without the money that they give them, the guns that they equip them with, the passports that they provide them, without all of this, the whole scaffolding of international terrorism would simply collapse, and the whole phenomena would hit the dust. The posture of Europe, frankly, has been the weak link in the recent turnabout against terrorism. This state-sponsored warfare is really the sponsorship of basically two sets of states. Some Islamic and radical Arab regimes, Libya, Syria, Iran, South Yemen, and the Soviet Union that has encouraged all of them, has sponsored the communist terrorist groups on the European continent, has also worked in this hemisphere through Cuba.
Provided the hardware.
Provided everything. Much of the training. We found in Lebanon terrorists from dozens of countries, many of them who had been to the Soviet Union, not only Arab, had been there for training, had been equipped there, had been indoctrinated there, and sent back to the West to do whatever they ended up doing. The important thing to understand is that this is an assault, a political assault, orchestrated by the Soviet bloc with these other countries that is meant to demoralize, to use your word, to demoralize, destabilize, weaken us. Now, this is a genie that leaves the bottle, and we can get these regimes, Libya, Iran. Think of Gaddafi or Khomeini being accustomed to the idea that they can do anything they want, send their killers anywhere, strike at anyone, anytime, then you may very well find yourself in a world in a few years from now with a Gaddafi or Khomeini with nuclear weapons. The stakes here are enormous. They're not the numbers of people who've been killed, they're the obliteration of that line.
Yeah, Paul Johnson has a brilliant essay in your book on that point. But you know what distresses me?
Let me just complete one thought here. There is no halfway measure against terrorism.
Well, I agree.
Those who launch terrorists, the launchers of the terrorists and the perpetrators of terrorism are themselves legitimate object of response.
Well, let's say Gaddafi is
a perfect example. Let me give you, Michael, another example. I have a crime family here. The crime family hides somewhere. The godfather of the family sends hitmen. You can get at the hitman. You want to also get at the godfather, but he's hiding out in some mountain estate. The only way, he's not going to give up. The only way you can get to him, you try various means, the only way you can get to him is send in the police or the FBI and have a shootout. That's exactly what you should do. The only difference is Gaddafi has a mountain kingdom, isn't it, state, or a desert kingdom. In other words, the means you apply, they don't necessarily have to go to the extremes that you say, but the principle is that those who launch terrorists, those who perpetrate terrorist actions are themselves legitimate target of response. They are not innocent civilians. If under no circumstances will I strike a terrorist because I might have some civilian casualties, we will give the terrorists an invincible shield with which they could kill us again and again and again.
To examine the anti-terrorism bill passed by the Senate by a lopsided majority in June, it was outspokenly a reaction to the bombing in Oklahoma City. The question has arisen, do some of the bill's provisions go too far? It is the conviction of several of our guests here that the answer is yes.
Why does it matter who hit Willie? I mean, my thesis is...
Let Ms. Tensing say what she wants to say.
My thesis is that these bills can be much needed, and yet they will sit around until some kind of horrible act occurs, and then they ride the train through the legislature. But, well, I want to go back a minute because the old lawyer researcher in me has a hard time with your chart. I want to know, with your chart, where does Pan Am 103, with over 100 and some dead Americans, sit in that? Is it just the number of attacks, so that Pan Am 103 shooting down is only one incident and it is equated with some kind of small bombing that actually never went off?
Well, if your argument is with the State Department, if your argument is with the State Department, bring it up with them because they have a number of charts in the back of their book.
There's a valid reason to have information as to how many attacks occur.
I would agree with you.
But there's also, I bet the State Department has another chart.
They do,
that tells how many victims.
Right.
And
in every instance, attacks from the Middle East pale in the face of attacks that take place against the U.S., terrorist attacks against the U.S. in Latin America.
And the same is true when you look at domestic issues of terrorism. In the Mideast is generally responsible for Pan Am 103.
The bottom line, when Mr. President proposed the executive order in January of this year freezing the assets of terrorist groups, I think there were 18 groups, and I think 16 of them were Arab or Muslim militants. The other 2 were Jewish groups.
There were 12 groups, and 10 were Arab Muslim and 2 were Jewish.
Now, that in itself was not a racist act. It was not a McCarthyite act. That was a fact of life. There is a veritable terrorist threat. There are militant Islamic groups. They have penetrated the United States in terms of establishing networks. Saying that is not a racist statement. We recognize that. We also recognize that they are unrepresentative of the larger Muslim community. However, the legislation is designed to stop that small, narrow fringe of extremists, whether they be Islamic or Jewish or any other religion.
Or native.
What?
Or native.
Well, yes, but I think that the bill itself initially was generated more by the threat of these extremist groups coming in from the outside. And I think it's been readapted to accommodate the current threat in the United States.
The executive order was wrong. It was wrong for the reason that was offered, to support the peace process. That is not the way to support the peace process. We want the peace process to work, but we do not feel that this particular way of doing it is going to do anything other than delegitimize those who in fact support the process.
Those were terrorist groups.
Number two, limiting financial support for the humanitarian, not just the humanitarian activities of Hamas and other groups listed, but humanitarian activity of groups affiliated with, related to, or groups that somehow may have on their board of directors a member of Hamas or the Democratic Front or something like that. That is going to be held to implement. It's going to prove, I think, very detrimental to the civil liberties of people in this country, and it's basically not workable, and it's going to hurt. The fact is, though, is that if you look at face value, the number of acts of violence committed in this country by Arabs or Muslims pale in the face of those committed by others, and yet the executive order is limited to Middle Eastern related. The argumentation about this particular legislation is limited to Arabs and Muslims.
Why don't you accept
and the fact is that it ought to
by
look in other parts of the world. It ought to look in Central American or Puerto Rican or Cuban or Jewish, which is 16, but very few acts, namely 3, have occurred in this country on the hands of Arabs and Muslims.
Does the bill say this is only targeted against Muslims?
The executive order does.
No, but the executive order has nothing to do with the bill. The bill doesn't say we're going against Muslims.
Findings that
But that's a very separate issue from the other one that you brought out, which is that any violent crime can be terrorism. There's a very good legal, prosecutive reason for that. And that is, whenever a person goes to court as a prosecutor and has to prove a crime, then you have to prove the elements of the crime. 1, 2, 3, whatever they are, you have to prove the elements. No prosecutor wants to go in and prove that somebody committed a crime because they wanted to coerce a government or whatever all these, highfalutin definitions of terrorism are. So we made a decision, a policy decision in the 1980s that we would make the specific, the Justice Department when I was there developing the terrorism section, that we would keep the violent crimes as the basic crimes of terrorism, and then we would have the Attorney General certify whenever she or he thought that this was a crime of terrorism. That way, we did not have to get into some kind of complicated, convoluted crime that we had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
I don't think we can wrap this debate about the issue under this hoary notion that somehow it is racist, McCarthyism, or that people who give to hospitals will somehow be sentenced to 10-year terms. It addresses a very particular issue of the danger of foreign groups in the United States masquerading under false cover. And that's why part of the bill was introduced. We have to recognize that when the head of the CIA says that militant Islamic groups have created an infrastructure in the United States from which they recruit and raise funds and also have developed terrorist cells, that is not something that is racist or McCarthyite. That's a fact of life. It doesn't reflect upon the larger Muslim community any way than the JDL's existence reflects upon the larger Jewish community.
Thank you.